My name is Gabe Dilly, and I'm currently working on a biology major at Principia, and my focus here for the last 6 weeks has been on rewilding in the Lake District. The reason I chose rewilding as my topic is partly because I've done some work with rewilding on Principia campus, and I was really interested to see how those things might differ here in the UK, and also because, as I'm sure you guys all know, rewilding is a very contentious topic as well. So as for defining rewilding, ask any group in England how they would define it, and you're likely to get different answers from everyone. According to the Oxford Dictionary, rewilding is to restore an area of land to its natural, uncultivated state. According to Forestry England, rewilding is more about moving in a direction where human intervention is not necessary. While there's not necessarily a conclusive idea of how to define the term, almost every group can agree that rewilding is a very complex issue and an especially charged word. Take, for example, Friends of the Lake District, who avoid the word entirely and opt for calling it nature recovery. Ultimately, the term itself is really inconsequential, and it's truly the goals that matter. Most groups agree that promoting biodiversity and restoring depleted landscape is important, especially considering that since the 1970s, the UK has lost almost half of its biodiversity and 97% of wild meadows. On top of this, there's starting to be increased pressure from flooding and large rain events due to climate change. One key aspect to understanding the rewilding movement is to first understand how views of nature has shaped over time. In the Renaissance era, the commonly held view of nature was that it was something to be subjugated and controlled, which is shown in poems like To Penshurst by Ben James. This shifted slightly with the writings of William Gilpin, who established the idea of the picturesque, and really cemented the idea that nature is only valuable because of the views that it can show. The most well-known writer in the Lake District, William Wordsworth, again changed this view of nature. And a good example of this can be found in his poem Nutting. Wordsworth's view can best be described as something that one delights in, and this is illustrated when he comes across a grove of hazels in the forest, where he writes, "A little while I stood, breathing with such suppression of the heart as joy delights in." He also describes nature as something that he personally takes extreme happiness in, putting him in a temper known to those who, after long and weary expectation, have been blessed with sudden happiness beyond all hope. Overall, though, Wordsworth's view of nature can be summed up in one line, where he writes that nature creates a sweet mood when pleasure loves to pay tribute to ease. This view of nature has a definite influence from Gilpin, as it still shows the value of nature primarily being based on how it is serving humans. However, Wordsworth also writes in his Guide to the Lakes, "Work where you can in the spirit of nature with an invisible hand." This quote shows that Wordsworth also values the natural processes of nature, which is a large step towards a less anthropocentric view of nature. And the next big shaper of how nature has been viewed is John Ruskin. And Ruskin really leans into the idea that nature can reciprocate. So we must treat nature well in order that it will treat us well. There's also the much famous author Beatrix Potter, whose works were able to give many young people a connection to nature that they otherwise would not have had. In modern times, authors such as Mbresh Maruya and artists like Maddie Nicholson have highlighted the fact that these authors have perpetrated a view of nature that often separates nature from humans, and it makes a lot of people feel excluded for various reasons. And that's where we get to rewilding. When it comes to rewilding in the Lake District, there are really two main groups that are opposed to it, and these are farmers who are resistant to changing their practices, and groups who are invested in conserving the cultural heritage of the area, such as Friends of the Lake District. For farmers, it can be a very complex issue to navigate, especially concerning the alienation they face from ecologists who believe that sheep are only destructive and should be entirely removed from the land. An example of this would be in Haweswater, where all the sheep were initially removed from the landscape, and even though they were eventually brought back, it was only a fraction of the number of the sheep that were there before. There are also several people who believe that it's not the sheep that should be blamed, but rather the shepherds. And both of these issues ultimately stem from a sort of eco-colonialism, which is a concept that I was introduced to by Julia Aglambi, where ecologists, often those from cities, come out to the country to tell farmers what they need to change on their farms, despite not making any efforts whatsoever in their own communities. These farmers were also raised with government policies that favored large flocks of sheep, such as headage, which paid farmers based on how many animals they had. This headage policy stemmed from a post-World War effort to make England more self-reliant for food, but despite no longer having these policies, the idea of how big a flock of sheep should be was majorly inflated because of them, and this has really had lasting effects on the landscape in general. On top of all this, there are countless numbers of people who feel as if they cannot afford to convert to a more sustainable way of farming because the upfront cost is so large. The main reasons that cultural conservationists resist rewilding is that they believe that it's an attack on the cultural heritage of the Lake District, such as on the sheep or on stone walls and hedges. The most well-known group that supports conserving cultural heritage is Friends of the Lake District, like I mentioned earlier. Their views are heavily influenced through the writings of authors such as William Gilpin and Beatrix Potter. Gilpin really pushed the idea of the picturesque, which is an aesthetic that values a balance between sublime and beautiful. And some of these groups believe that by reforesting and rewiggling rivers, the picturesque aspects of the landscape can be lost. Beatrix Potter was a huge supporter of hill farming culture and made major efforts to ensure that it was not lost. And many of these groups also believe that by reducing sheep flock size, they start to threaten the livelihood of farmers, as well as detract from what makes the Lake District truly special. Many of these groups are also against fencing, and it's hard to argue that large, obvious fences can detract from the view, especially when they could be replaced with stone walls or hedges that more properly align with the cultural background of the area. There's also a view among many environmentalists that sheep, which Friends of the Lake District believe are a cultural cornerstone, are killing the landscape. And this idea is typified in books such as Feral, where the author George Monbiot claims that the Lake District should get rid of all of the sheep. Many of the groups feel that this is a direct attack on the culture of sheep farming, and it definitely is. However, I believe that rewilding is not actually at odds with either of these things, as instead something that can be used in conjunction with farming and maintaining culture. Good guidelines for a more unbiased view of nature can be found in articles like Aesthetic Appreciation of Nature and Environmentalism by Alan Carlson. In that paper, he proposes 5 guidelines for how something can be truly natural. He says that they must have an acentric rather than an anthropocentric appreciation of nature, an environmentally focused rather than scenery-obsessed appreciation, a serious rather than superficial and trivial appreciation, objective rather than subjective appreciation, and morally engaged rather than morally vacuous appreciation. When properly applied, all these guidelines would certainly lead to a truly natural environment, but strict adherence to this guide is not only impractical in a land with as deep a history as the Lake District, but it would also serve to alienate farmers and cultural conservationists even more. Therefore, a balance must be found between a totally farmed landscape and an exclusively natural landscape. And ultimately, my vision of the future is a landscape in which farmers could take on more of a conservationist role, promoting biodiversity while continuing to farm the land. There are many examples of individual farmers working to rewild their lands, such as James Rebanks or Chris Hodgson. In Rebanks' latest book, English Pastoral, he highlights the efforts he personally has made to increase biodiversity on his own farm. He's implemented rotational grazing, and he's rewiggled the river that's on his property. And just from those small efforts that he's made, he's already seen an increase in the biodiversity of his land. He also started to notice that he has to spend less money each year on inputs such as fertilizers, as the soil is allowed to naturally regenerate. And he's been able to have a much more diverse income through various environmental schemes. Other farmers, like Chris Hodgson, have done a lot of planting native trees and have also been able to benefit from environmental schemes that help him to live instead of just farming. Not only is there a financial benefit to these schemes, but there's also the benefit of farming in wood pastures, which allows for greater shade for animals, which is important considering a changing climate, and the added benefit of carbon sequestration. There are also several trusts who work with farmers in order to farm in a more sustainable way. For example, the John Muir Trust is starting to work with local farmers on land owned by United Utilities in order to promote better water quality through reducing flock sizes and gaining a larger income from environmental schemes that the farmers might not be able to navigate or apply for on their own. The same thing is happening in a more advanced stage at Haweswater with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, or the RSPB. While they initially got rid of all farming and faced a lot of backlash for it, they're now starting to reintroduce sheep to the landscape. And not only are they reintroducing sheep, but they're also aiming to create a more diversified farming landscape in general. And so they're introducing native cows and fell ponies. This more diverse structure is similar to the traditional way of farming and allows for natural regeneration of forests, much like there would have done back in the history that Wyatt was talking about earlier. There's also an increased push in Haweswater for major environmental restoration projects that are on a landscape scale, such as hay meadows and larger river restoration. And these projects help with flood mitigation primarily, and as well as all the other efforts, they help to generate revenue due to various environmental schemes. There's also a growing movement of people who work to bridge the gap between farmers and conservationists, such as Rob and Harriet Fraser. And their work focuses heavily on a sense of place, and especially how we as humans interact with nature. Through outreach, they've been able to connect groups of people who likely would never have interacted with each other due to the alienation that they've been put through. Groups like Friends of the Lake District, whose main goal is still conservation of culture, have also started to make efforts to restore nature. According to their website, one large goal of theirs is to increase woodland cover in Cumbria and better manage existing woodlands. In order to do this, they plant native trees, especially around streams and becks, in order to help with flood mitigation as well as biodiversity. They also raise awareness for projects that would negatively impact forest health. On top of their efforts to replant forests, they help farmers navigate the intricacies of the environmental schemes in order to benefit the most they can from the work that they put in. And this overall increases the financial stability of the farms as well as the resilience of the natural landscape. Farmers face a variety of benefits from rewilding, such as increased income through subsidies and schemes, and less need for inputs such as fertilizers. There have already been several environmental schemes that farmers and landowners can apply for, but there are also several new plans for environmental schemes, with the most well-known probably being the Environmental Land Management, or ELM scheme. This scheme has 3 different levels, the smallest focusing on soil restoration, the middle scale focusing on regenerating nature such as tree planting, and the third and largest scale focusing on landscape restoration works, which are likely to include multiple farms and landowners. While these details are still likely to change, they show that there is an increasing monetary incentive towards protecting and restoring biodiversity. Not only are they getting paid more to take care of the land, the farmers are also getting healthier soils from the land, as was evidenced by what James Rebanks said in his book. Groups that focus on conserving the culture for the Lake District also benefit from these same rewilding efforts. Not only do these groups qualify for the same environmental schemes, but these schemes also create a more resilient farming community that doesn't rely only on market prices for animals. There are also more job opportunities that are created from these schemes. For example, in Haweswater, they've gone from having only 2 to 3 employees to about 30, and these jobs are often open to locals and help to foster a growing community that cares about the environment and the culture of the Lake District. There's also the benefit of natural flood mitigation and water purification, again illustrated by Haweswater, and also in Innerdale. By restoring the native forests and stream ecosystems, there's less of a need for large, jarring water purification stations on the landscape, which greatly impact the view of nature. By increasing forest coverage, there's also increased habitat for endangered species such as red squirrels. And as evidenced by Innerdale and Haweswater, there's room for a return to a more diverse pre-war agricultural system that incorporates not only sheep, but local breeds of cattle, such as Galloways and fell ponies. Not a breed of cattle, they're horses. But not only is it possible to do this, but it benefits the environment and preserves the cultural heritage of the Lake District. And that's what I have. Thank you.